Hey guys, Mark here. For a long time I've been building full-size ATX PCs, and while they can be the most powerful and versatile rigs, they're not the most portable things on the planet. So today I decided to switch it up a little bit and build something a bit different. Let's build a $500 gaming PC that you can fit in a backpack. So the first thing we have to do is determine what we need. I wanted this to be a build that's small and cheap, yet powerful enough to run most modern games at the max settings and a resolution of 1080p. I set a budget of around $500 USD and started digging. The first thing I looked at was the case. This is a Silverstone SG13B, and it's one of the smallest cases I've ever seen that supports not only an ATX power supply but also a full-length GPU. If you really wanted to, you could fit a GTX 1080 Ti in here, no problem. The case has a space for a 120mm fan up top that blows air throughout the entire case. For that, I used a Corsair AF120. The case supports one 2.5-inch hard drive or SSD and one 3.5-inch hard drive. The front I/O is simple and has two USB 3.0 ports and a headphone and microphone jack. This case is so small it actually fits inside a small backpack. Next up was the processor and graphics card. Considering I wanted to keep the budget low, there were only a few options in the processor department. I went with an Intel G4560. This is a Pentium dual-core processor, and while it won't do much in the way of heavy multitasking or video editing, this thing actually performs extremely well with gaming, but I'll get to that later. For the GPU, I went with a GTX 980. I know, last generation. I managed to get a sweet deal on this card used though, which is why I bought it. However, if you're looking to buy a similarly priced card that's just as good, go with the GTX 1060. The 1050 Ti will do just fine, but at the cost of performance. It might be a good idea to buy a blower style GPU since this case is very small and only uses one fan. That way all the air will be ejected through the rear of the case instead of being pushed out into the case. Then I needed a motherboard that can fit inside the tiny SG13B. I went with a budget board to keep the cost down. The Gigabyte H110N. It doesn't have a whole lot of goodies like internal Wi-Fi or overclocking abilities, but it serves our purpose just fine. What it does have is a spot for a Wi-Fi card and even has an M2 slot for a tiny SSD if we want to go that route. The RAM I went with is the Kingston HyperX Fury. I only picked up two 4GB cards for a total of 8GB of RAM, but that should be fine for most gaming applications. For storage, I kept the price low by buying a PNY 120GB SSD. It's small, but we can always supplement that by using a larger 3.5-inch hard drive since the case allows for it. Finally, we need something to power the PC. I chose the EVGA 450BT. It's non-modular and doesn't supply a whole lot of power, but it was cheap and works just fine for this build. And that's all the parts, so let's put it all together. Before rolling the video, I had already installed the motherboard, I/O shield, and fan, so we'll start with the SSD. You want to do this first because if not, everything else gets in the way. Next up is the CPU. This was an easy installation since we were just using the stock cooler. All I had to do was drop the CPU into the slot and tighten the stock cooler down onto the CPU. The cooler comes with thermal paste pre-applied, so we don't even have to do that. After it's done, I plugged in the CPU fan and then it's onto the RAM. In hindsight, I should have installed or plugged in the front I/O switches first, because this gets kinda hard when the RAM gets in the way, but oh well, I did that backwards. You'll see me looking at my phone multiple times to make sure that I have all the cables plugged in correctly. Once I had everything from the front panel connected, it was time to add power to the rig. I started putting it in wrong at first and then had to reroute it. The case has a small angle support to keep the PSU in place. After that, I connected all the power. The hardest part of this was actually getting the power to the SSD since it was already screwed to the bottom of the case. After multiple attempts at getting power to it, I unscrewed the SSD, plugged it back in, and then reinstalled it. Finally, it was time for the GPU. The front of the case has to be removed in order to fit the reference 980 into the case, and then it's just plug and play from there. Easy peasy. This is the end result. It's a little more bland than I'm used to because of the lack of a side window, but I sort of like that it flies under the radar. With all the components in there, it's still fairly lightweight and it's pretty solid too. And guess what? It can fit inside of a small backpack. Have I mentioned that yet? You can fit a few small peripherals in there too, but you'll have to find another way to carry a monitor unless you wanted to use one of those small USB type monitors from Asus. Now for the most important part. Let's test the performance. Since we went with a budget dual-core processor, I know we won't be getting much out of programs like Premiere or After Effects, but 1080p gaming is a different story altogether. The first game I tested was Overwatch. Overwatch is a very well optimized game, so I didn't expect to encounter many problems here. Sure enough, it ran flawlessly, hitting the 60 FPS mark in both 1080p and 1440p at max settings. Then I tried a more CPU and GPU intensive game, Battlefield 1. Here I started to encounter a bit of a frame rate drop when playing multiplayer, dipping to around the 50 FPS mark. After decreasing a few of the settings, however, the performance improved to a solid 60 frames per second. Then I tried the Dolphin emulator with a few GameCube games. This one works a bit differently since it outputs a native resolution of 30 frames per second, but it did run all the games I tried to run smoothly. Finally, I did a rendering job in Premiere Pro of a small 3-minute video file render with minimal effects applied. As expected, it took a whopping 6 minutes to complete. Don't buy a dual-core Pentium if you're trying to do video editing, it's just a terrible idea. So for a $500 gaming rig, this thing performs great. It's a little bland and it suffers in the rendering department, but for what I paid, I got a great gaming experience in a tiny package that I can take with me wherever I go. So if you like this video, please subscribe and leave me a thumbs up. And if you didn't, feel free to leave a comment telling me why below. Feedback always helps me put together better content. Thanks for watching and have a great day.